Welcome to Minnesota Issues. My guest today is Mortimer J. Adler, the well-known philosopher and educator whose long career has been devoted to the organizing and disseminating of the great ideas of history. Mr. Adler is chairman of the board of editors of the Encyclopedia Britannica and director of the Institute for Philosophical Research. In a new work, Mr. Adler is calling for radical reform of the American educational system. The work is called the Paideia Proposal, an educational manifesto which is the subject of today's Minnesota Issues. Welcome, Mr. Adler, to Minnesota Issues. Mr. Adler, in your proposal, on page 23, in fact, you summarize succinctly what your proposal is. You call for the same course of study for all pupils, all students during the first 12 years of schooling. Same course of study which consists of 3 divisions: the acquisition of organized knowledge, the development of intellectual skills, and the enlarged understanding of ideas and values. How does your proposal, given these objectives, differ from what the school system at present is seeking?
Well, let me first comment on the proposal itself, because it isn't quite accurate to say that that diagram represents a curriculum. This is a nation given to a highly pluralistic system of education. There are 25,000 independent, autonomous boards of education and school boards, each with the authority and power to determine the curriculum in its own district. And we intend that to be the case. It would be presumptuous of us to say this is the curriculum. That diagram says that a good curriculum, which would be the same for all children in any given district, though not the same across the country, should involve no electives, except the choice of a second language, should be constructed within the framework that that diagram sets. Now, that diagram says that a good course of study, the same in quality for all the students, should involve the 3 kinds of learning you mentioned, but you must also mention the 3 kinds of teaching, because each of those 3 kinds of learning involves a different kind of teaching. And the reason why I say what I've just said is many school people would claim that those 3 kinds of learning are present in the schools. I say they are not present in the schools because the other 2 kinds of teaching are not there. The only kind of teaching that is now present in the schools, by and large, there may be minuscule exceptions across the country, but for the most part, 99% of the time, the only kind of teaching that goes on in the schools is the kind of teaching that I would call teaching by telling, didactic teaching, lecturing, using textbooks, using examinations and quizzes. That kind of teaching is only useful.
But Mr. Adler, don't our students in high school learn a lot through extracurricular activities, through music, through plays, through sports?
That has nothing to do with it. Unless the other, that kind of teaching is only, even when it's at its best, and for the most part it's not at its best, is only satisfactory or useful for the first kind of learning, the acquisition of organized knowledge in the basic fields of subject matter like literature, language, and the fine arts, mathematics and the natural sciences, history, geography, and the social studies. The other 2 kinds of teaching must be present, otherwise you will not get the development of intellectual skills, and you will not get the enlargement of the understanding of ideas and values. The second kind of teaching that goes with the second kind of learning is coaching, and there's very little. When I went to school before the First World War in New York City, I was coached in reading and writing and arithmetic and the basic intellectual operations, so that I was very proficient as a writer and a reader by the time I was 10 or 12. That doesn't exist anymore.
What's the explanation for that?
I've said again and again, no one knows, because the causes are so intricate, there's so many converging factors that interact with one another. No one could give an account of why the schools have declined as miserably as they've declined.
Clearly it's related to the social environment, in part, certainly.
It could be, but I don't know.
Now, in your proposal, you are very clear in stating the objectives and what the elements of the same course of study for all should be, but you pay almost no attention to the social environment, to the social problems, the lack of preparation that many students have in coming to the school system.
Well, we do pay attention to that, because we do say that where the children come from culturally disadvantaged homes, where there's a nurtural deficiency in the home, We wish to remedy that by preschool tutelage. Now, we are paying attention to that. But you asked me what's wrong with the schools. The answer is that only one kind of teaching and learning is there. The other kind, two kinds of teaching and learning that must be present in the schools is not present. Now, that's only one. There are two things wrong with the schools. First, the American school system is fundamentally anti-democratic. It's a two-track or three-track system. We give the same quantity of schooling to all the children, but not the same quality. Secondly, even for the favored few to whom we give the better quality, the quality is too poor, because it's limited to that first kind of teaching and learning and involves very little coaching and almost no Socratic teaching, the dialogue method of discussion sitting around a table.
Now, you would drop all extracurricular activities?
No, I drop all electives.
All electives?
All electives and all vocational training. By vocational training, I mean particularized job training, the kind of training that fits a person to a particular job niche. All that's out of the schools for the first 12 years. After 12 years, vocational preparation can take place in technical institutes or on the job or in junior colleges, community colleges, but not in those first 12 years of basic schooling. There shall be no electives and no particularized job training. Extracurricular activities
but yet, young people arrive at the school system with different levels of capability.
And they'll end up with different achievements too, because we aren't changing. We're not hoping to change the fundamental range of differences among individuals with respect to their native endowment or with respect to their nurtural advantages. All we're saying is, with all those inequalities recognized, inequalities in nurture and inequalities in nature. Some children are brighter than others, some are more apt learners, more rapid learners, some can learn more. But they should all have the same quality so that each is, shall I say, educated during those, not educated, but schooled up to his capacity during those years.
Do you have in your mind how the day would differ under your system from what the day would be is like today?
Well, the school system now operates on a very rigid grid. There are 5 days a week, usually 7 class hours a day running 50 minutes in an ordinary classroom with the teacher standing in front of the room and the students sitting in rows and blackboards and so on. The kind of teaching and learning that I call Socratic, for the sake of enlarging the understanding of ideas and values, should occur 2 hours once a week in a totally different kind of room. Students sitting around a hollow square table with the teacher sitting at the table carrying on discussion. The kind of teaching I'm calling coaching should occur infrequently and irregularly, but as needed. And different children should get different amounts of coaching, because some will acquire these intellectual skills. For example, it's much easier for a coach to teach one person to play tennis than another. He has natural aptitudes, so that you don't give them all the same amount of coaching time. The rigid schedule and the rigidity of the classroom apparatus must be changed. You can't fit this very flexible kind of educational program into the rigid grid that now exists in the schools.
So you're saying, in effect, that your proposal would really give more attention to individual differences rather than less?
Precisely.
Now, doesn't this require a vast expansion in the amount of teaching time that's needed to give this individual attention?
No, because you'd give the more apt student less teacher time and the less apt student more teacher time. You don't give them all the same amount as you do now. You now give them all the same amount. It doesn't work at all. You must vary that amount according to the need of the student. I don't think, and we're throwing out so much that's non-essential to a basic school.
For example, what are the non-essentials?
All vocational training is non-essential. All the electives are not. There's an elective in the school system.
What electives are you referring to? What kinds of?
Many of our large city high schools offer the youngsters in high school 250 different electives, all kinds of courses that have no educational merit at all. We're saying they should all, in the kind of learning that is the acquisition of knowledge, they should all be taught mathematics and natural science up through calculus and mathematics and up through physics in natural science. They should all have 12 years of instruction in the use of the English language and 8 years of instruction in a foreign language. They should all have 12 years of instruction in history and geography. They should all have 12 years of instruction in the intellectual skills, coaching in the intellectual skills which are the skills of learning, And for 12 years, everyone from grade 1 to grade 12 should be involved in at least once a week for 2 hours or sometimes less with younger children in a discussion program.
It sounds to me, though, that to do all of what you propose would require a lot of one-on-one instruction and would require...
Not the seminar is 1 on 25. The lecture could be 1 on 1,000.
Still would represent... Did your committee consider at any point the notion of a national service program so that young people would be available for this kind of paraprofessional work?
Well, we did consider the possibility of a national service program, yes. And since we weren't able to, we thought that it had difficult social obstacles in its way, but I would like to reconsider that, as a matter of fact. I think, but that would come after the 12 years are over, not during the 12 years.
Yes, I'm just thinking about the availability of people that would help with this process of reform, so that there would be the additional time that would be required for the individual attention.
Our calculation is, and it may be wrong until we work it out in detail, is that this would not be more costly than the present school system. But it may very well be, it may be wrong about that.
You say that you don't propose a common curriculum. What you're proposing here is a common framework.
Yes.
That there might be regional differences.
Definitely. Oh, definitely.
Can you describe how would, if it's a common schooling we're seeking,
what's common about it? What's common to it are the kinds of learning and the kinds of teaching. For example, in one part of the country, this particular set of books, collection of books might be read. These works of art might be studied. The teaching of mathematics and the natural sciences might use this textbook or that textbook. All those things are left to choice by the individual school system. But that they should all have mathematics is not left to anybody's choice. They should all have natural science up to physics is not left to anybody's choice. They should all have history and geography and social studies is not a matter of choice. That's required. I mean, in other words, how those things are done, the materials used, the way they're organized, is a matter of individual choice. But that framework leaves many requirements to be observed by all.
Mr. Adler, specifically, for example, in the field of mathematics, there is today an enormous shortage of teachers of mathematics.
I know.
How would you propose that we would fill the need? This would clearly impose a need for a vast expansion of people in the field.
The reason why you have, I think, the shortage of teachers of mathematics is because anyone who has the knowledge to teach mathematics and the skill to teach it can earn so much more money not teaching but using his mathematical skills in industry. It may very well be that you're going to have to raise the salaries of teachers to make teacher salaries, teacher compensation competitive with other occupations.
It's still a puzzle in my mind about what you do with the youngsters that come from the dispossessed and deprived ghetto areas.
Well, the answer to that is what the French have done. You see, the thing that you must remember is that we're 5 years behind the French. The French had at one time, until 1977, the most elitist system of education in Europe. At age 11, they divided the children into the sheep and the goats. The goats were sent off this way and the sheep were sent on to the higher schools. In 1977, the French Senate, the French Parliament rather, not the Senate, passed an Education Act which called for giving all the children the same quality of schooling, exactly the same curriculum for the whole of France. They recognized that some children were deprived, that some children came from, shall I say, culturally deficient homes, and were therefore less prepared for school than other children were. And they instituted the process of what they called preschool. In fact, their words were the école maternelle, preschool tutelage, see? And in the classroom, they recognized that individual differences. Some children are going to be slower learners and less apt than others, and they instituted the practice of remedial instruction, individual help for those students that needed individual help.
Now, the charge, as you know, is made that your proposal really is essentially elitist. Professor David Reisman of Harvard has made that charge.
I agree. It's elitist, but it's democratic elitism. At one time, when you had restricted suffrage, the citizens were the elite. You now have universal suffrage. Everybody is elite as a citizen. I'm saying this is definitely elitist. Elitism means a high quality, but for everyone. It is democratic elitism.
Now, where does the initiative and the leadership for instituting these changes come from?
It must come from the superintendents of schools. and from local school boards. I'm delighted to report that the Board of Education of the City of Atlanta has passed a resolution endorsing the Paideia proposal and authorizing Dr. Alonzo Krim, who's the superintendent of schools, to put it into operation in a pilot plant operation. I think Ruth Love has the same authorization from the School Board of Chicago, and she's going to try it. So got 2 cities going to try it. I hope it will be tried in either St. Paul or Minneapolis. I think it's going to be tried in Texas, in California, in New England, in Maryland.
Do you see the need for some kind of major change in the structure of public education in terms of the many, many school districts we have and the state involvement?
No, I don't think you can expect that to happen. I do think that some changes in state laws have to be made to change the criteria for certifying teachers. I think there'll be some changes of that kind required.
Can you what specifically would you think should be changed?
Because there are requirements now about attendance of getting a certain kind of degree in a school of education, which I don't think should be required. I think there are other ways of certifying teachers much better than that. But I don't think you can change the pluralism. You know, be nice in one way to have a national Ministry of Education as they have in France. It would be much simpler to do it. But that's not the spirit of this country.
Is there some special role that the federal government should play? Should there be a federal aid that would encourage and serve as a push to
At one time, in the pre-Reagan days, there was federal aid to the states and the cities, but that's been withdrawn. But after all, Reagan isn't going to be president forever.
But would you think that for your program to succeed, that there should be some active federal intervention?
I do think so. But it is very hard in this country to expect it because the Department of Education really has very little concern with education. The Department of Education in the United States is mainly concerned with being sure that there are no discriminations among blacks and whites, being sure there's no discrimination between men and women. It is filled with major problems, social problems, rather educational problems.
You're very much concerned with the basic lack of, say, mathematics and science instruction and so on. Is this a role that we should have maybe special support for through the federal government to be sure that the stations in our economy and the stations in our whole society are manned?
Well, I really think both the 2 parts of our society that are suffering most from the badness of the schooling are the major corporations, the industrial corporations, and the military. I really think our national security is endangered because the officers of the Navy and the Army that I've talked to, and the Air Force, would say that if you had to fight a defensive war with conventional weapons, conventional war, we wouldn't have the trained manpower to do it.
The matter of the relationship with the private schools comes into this picture, doesn't it?
Yes.
You talk about the responsibility for public schooling. Now, in recent years, there's been an increased movement
There's been a drift to the private schools.
Drift to the private
and the reason for that, obviously, is because the public schools are so poor that parents who can afford it, who make every effort to make ends meet in order to afford it, don't want their children to go to public schools but to private schools. That's what's wrong. You see, if that were to go on, you would have an un-American society. You'd have a 2-class society. The preppies on the one hand and the public school children on the other. There'd be really 2 different classes in our society as they grew up, as there is in England, as a matter of fact. Very definite. People that go to the public schools, which are the private schools of England, are a distinct class from those who go to the county schools and the local municipal schools. I would say that the most important objective of the Paideia proposal is to make the public schools so good that we can dispense with private schools, except if there are parochial reasons, religious reasons for parochial school. I have nothing to say on that subject. That's another point that I don't want to get into. But the non-parochial private schools, I would hope, should go out of existence.
Well, now, what does this say with respect to the developing movement for a voucher system, which would permit
we shouldn't have it. So we shouldn't have it.
Did you see, though, something in the private...
That merely is to support the private schools, you see.
So you would think that the voucher system would be antagonistic to the reform proposal that you're advancing?
The voucher system would simply increase the flow of the children from the public to the private schools.
When we started, I had meant to ask you to say just a word about the fact that this is a product of a group of people.
Yeah, there are 22 of us.
And can you say a bit about where this idea comes from and in terms of those who are supporting it and working for it?
All of my colleagues, the 22 people whose names are mentioned as signing this book with me, all have been deeply considered. They're very various. There are some ordinary public school people like Ruth Love and Alonzo Grimm, the principal of a high school. There are some college presidents, Jacques Bosman, who was provost of Columbia University. There are professors at Harvard and Yale and University of Colorado and the University of Southern California. It's a quite various group, all of whom have been deeply concerned about public education.
Now, does this group, do they contemplate a sustained campaign? Would you be making this an organized effort over the country?
Well, we're planning to write a second book, a follow-up to this book, explaining the details of that program much more elaborately, so that people who say, how do we do this, will get some further counsel and advice. But I think we should not be responsible for, I think the money should be found to create a Paideia Foundation or a Paideia Bureau, which would be responsible, be the sort of the national focus for all the activities that lead to this reform.
The big question, Mr. Adler, that I think would be in many people's minds, especially now with the crushing problem of finance for public education, how do you anticipate the costs being met for this proposal?
Well, you know, I think the education of our children, that the young people of this country are our chief national resource, is more important, or is as important as national defense. We spend billions and billions and billions on national security and defense. I don't think we've ever spent as much money on education as we should. As far as I'm concerned, I think this country can afford to and should double or triple the budget, nationally, state, and city, for education.
Mr. Adler, I'd like to turn to a philosophical dimension of your proposal here. I was really much interested and somewhat amused, or bemused, I suppose I should say, that you have dedicated this work to Horace Mann, which is understandable, but to John Dewey and Robert Hutchins. Now, when I was an undergraduate back in the 30s, one of the first great intellectual controversies I heard about was John Dewey versus Robert Hutchins.
Yeah.
Dewey was a great progressive educator. Individual differences liberate the youngster from the conventional and traditional forms of education, and Hutchins stood for what you're discussing right now.
Well, I think that's a misunderstanding of Dewey. I think, by the way, they were not engaged in a controversy back in the 40s about about public schooling. The issue was the reforms we were doing at the University of Chicago, which Dewey was critical. But Dewey, if you read Democracy in Education, which is Dewey's great book in 1916, which I've reread carefully recently, I would say that the essence of this idea comes out of Dewey, more than out of Hutchins, as a matter of fact. That Hutchins and I, in those days, misunderstood Dewey, that Dewey misunderstood Hutchins. The controversy was really two ships passing in the night, not touching one another. And the most important thing I want to say is that Dewey was never a progressive educator, really. The progressive education movement arose as a misunderstanding of Dewey. I mean, most of his followers at Teachers College, Columbia, really didn't understand what Dewey was talking about. And he said so himself in a great speech he delivered in 1934, was published under the title of Experience in Education.
Do you see then your proposal as more or less reconciling the idea of a common education for everyone on the one hand, but on the other hand, the recognition of individual differences so that the individual has a greater chance to achieve human expression?
So you know, like murder, individual differences will out always. You can't suppress individual differences. We all live in the same physical environment. I mean, you know, we all react differently to it. Our individual differences doesn't call for a different environment for each of us. We live in a city with the same city, same world. So there's no suppression of individual differences by giving, in these early years, a common curriculum to all this, or a common course of study. I think electives and choices, at the parting of the ways, differentiation in schooling should happen at the college level, where people are near the choice of a career and a choice of a walk of life, you see. They shouldn't be doing that choice back in the first 12 years.
Mr. Adler, you only have a couple minutes left, and I'd like to just talk in sort of personal terms with you for a moment. That I think all your friends are amazed that here you are approaching your 80th year, and you're just as vital and energetic as you have been over these 60 or more years of active involvement in the intellectual life of the nation. What's the secret of your energy?
Well, as I always like to say, Two things. One, I don't take any exercise. And secondly, as the years go on, I manage to work harder and harder and harder. I don't sort of drop off and take it easy. I think this year, for example, with this project and the project of those Moyer's programs that I have to be responsible for, I'm doing more than I ever did before.
I want to say a word about the Moyer's programs because that's of interest to the viewers of Channel 2 and the other stations that carry Minnesota issues. That beginning Friday night, October 29th at 9:30 p.m., Channel 2 will carry the 6 programs. And maybe you might give us just a little advance word about...
The 6 programs are 6 discussions of 6 great ideas, about which I wrote a book a couple of years ago called 6 Great Ideas. And the order of the programs is the first one's on truth, second one's on beauty, third one's on goodness, fourth one's on liberty, the fifth is on equality, and the last one's on justice.
Is there one book that goes with each of the 6?
No, there's 6, one book for 6.
Yes, can you mention the books? We have just time.
No. There's one book.
One book.
I wrote a book called 6 Great Ideas.
Excuse me, I thought you were, I see, excuse me.
And the programs revolve around the chapters of that book.
The chapters of that book,
yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Do you find yourself in this kind of reform role as in a sort of strange water? We think of you as being
I really do. I've lived most of my life very actively in the life of the mind in an ivory tower, not in the world of practical affairs. And I almost resolved never to have anything to do with the world of practical affairs, but keep on thinking and letting other people handle the world of practical affairs. But now I'm, unfortunately, down on earth, immersed in this hurly-burly of educational reform.
Mortimer J. Adler, thank you very much for appearing with me on Minnesota Issues, and I wish you well in your enterprise.
Thank you.
My guests next week will be the 2 candidates for Congress in the 6th District, Arlen Erdahl, Independent Republican, and Eugene Sikorsky, Democrat Farmer Laborite. I hope you'll join us.